Welcome, beautiful people, to the Spartan Hoops podcast. It is the first original one that we're getting off the ground. I'm here with my co-host, Greg Waddell. This is kind of the beginning of something that I've wanted to get off the ground for a little bit. Me and Dan had done some podcasting. We just didn't quite find the time in the inaugural season for Spartan Hoops. And it's one of these situations where I want to continue to provide content across the way. Greg really has a good spice on the Michigan side of things, a more national exposure, conference talk. And so during the course of, the offseason as well as into the regular season, we're going to be doing some shows with Greg, some with Dan, one of my other friends, Carter Elliott. And really, we just want to kind of spice it up and give you a wide variety of coverage with obviously a large focus on Michigan State basketball. So before I get into exactly, Greg's allegiances and where that all lies, why don't we begin just kind of with the end of the season? So I want to touch briefly on the UCLA loss, kind of the general overview of the season, then we'll kind of take off from there. My first thought on the season, I said it in the article that I wrote following the loss, but predictable. That loss for me for the UCLA game was predictable. Up at halftime by 11, a game that they should have absolutely been able to close out, in my opinion. Obviously, UCLA goes on somewhat of a magical run to the Final Four. We got one of the better games we've gotten in a while between UCLA and Gonzaga, but Michigan State had control of that game heading into the half, and they let it slip away. And it was a scenario where Joey Hauser played long stretches on Jaime Jaquez and absolutely got lit up. Aaron Henry was slid over onto Jaquez for parts of the game. He got cooled off. Then Johnny Juzang gets going. There really wasn't an option for Michigan State. They didn't have two guys that could stop them. And I thought that just the decisions and the rotations were, again, a bit bumbled by the staff as we'd seen. And the late game execution, particularly the point guard play, which was a struggle the entire season, was really the downfall. You're up 5 points, under 2 minutes. You have to close that game out. And the late game execution, again, was failed to be provided by, a host of different people. But in the end, if you have a point guard to be able to lead you to the promised land there, maybe Michigan State makes it into the second weekend, which they haven't done in a while. 2020 was obviously taken from us. 2019, nice Final Four run. But outside of that, it's been a bit of a drought for Michigan State making the second weekend. And so, again, they fall a little bit short here. It's a little bit frustrating. What were your thoughts just generally with the way that game played out and, the general season for Michigan State?
Yeah, I'll start with the UCLA game. I mean, it's hard to look back at it now versus looking at it in the moment without taking everything UCLA did after that game into consideration. It's certainly, we'll get more into my allegiances later, but as someone who watched both the Michigan State game and the Michigan game and their seasons come to an end to the Bruins, now that I'm separated from the season, it gives me a little more peace as a fan to be like, okay, UCLA was really playing great basketball. You mentioned, they were trying to find answers to guard both Juzang and Jaquez. And to me, as I watched the UCLA run, there just weren't teams that had two guys who could guard both of those guys. And Juzang really caught more people by surprise, I think, or not by surprise by the Final Four. He was just on fire. But that first game, you had to basically pick who are we going to stick Henry on, and whoever he wasn't on was going to be able to get whatever he wanted. I thought MSU, played good basketball, great basketball in that first half. I thought this was another flip the switch. It's March, and here's Tom Izzo again. And I think looking back on it now, it's hard not to at least be proud of the effort and the fight they put up in that game, even if you have your own concerns and complaints about certain decisions that came out of it. I will say, and I don't know if you even want to get into this or not, but the halftime incident with Brown, I know Spartan fans in general are like rolling their eyes. Come on, this is a non-story. But at the same time, they were up, 11 at half? And it's just an odd moment, an odd thing to have going into the locker room. Not that dictated the second half, but that was a moment where I'm just like, okay, this doesn't feel like Michigan State's up 11 right now,
I don't disagree with you. I don't know what to make of how that impacted the halftime. You're up 11. It looked like there was some miscommunication between Hall and Brown on that switch. I'm not sure who was at fault. It actually looked to me when I went back and watched in the replay that it actually might have been Hall. So Izzo misinterpreted it, or perhaps he was right and Brown was at it. But it just seemed like, was that the moment that you really wanted to start digging in a guy who had played decently well that first half? And we're going to get to it, but I think generally the way that he handled Brown this year was extremely baffling to me. All around, I would say this was a real struggle of a season. And part of me, when that game finished, was almost relieved that we didn't have to watch this particular team and this particular coaching staff go through another game where it was just going to be, white knuckled and painful. Like, how many games were really enjoyable this year? I watched every single game twice over. I think I should deserve some type of award for that. I don't think anybody else did that in this, in this fan base. And to watch that through two times, like the Illinois game, that was enjoyable. That was a tip to finish where they just punched somebody in the mouth and they looked like classic Michigan State basketball. I really enjoyed that game. Maybe the Ohio State game you can throw in there as well. The second Michigan game,
yeah.
Even the Duke game early, they punched him in the mouth and then they got it a little bit hairy towards the end. So there really was only a handful of games that were enjoyable from the start to the finish. And so part of me was just thankful almost that it was over. Obviously it opens up a little bit in the bracket and possibly they can go on a run. And I saw it kind of over Twitter, throughout the course of it. People are saying, oh, this could have been our run. What about this team in any form or shape was consistent enough that you could say that they weren't just going to win one game, but two or three during the course of it? I thought that was a little bit of a stretch from the fan base there. Yes, the opponents were maybe not as daunting had you got past the original one and got into the field of 64 to be able to see what you had. But I think all around, this was just a roster that was generally constructed flawed, and it was compounded by the staff by playing early rotations. By early, I mean almost, halfway, 3/4 through the season, of the wrong guys, from the starters to the minutes allotted. It just was a real struggle. And we're going to dive into that a little bit more. But this is one of these things where, if I'm rating the staff for how this season went, I mean, C minus. I have a hard time giving them any sort of credit for them turning around the season. I give a lot more credit to the players because the staff finally did what they had to do, which was play the best, 8 guys that they had. And they failed to do that for, 20 games out of the 30 from the season. So why should the staff get credit for doing what they should have done, 10 games into the season? Yes, there was a turnaround, but maybe Michigan State would have got it together had some of those guys gotten a chance to play together like game 10, 11, 12, and in through kind of the Big Ten play. So it was a real frustrating season all around. I think it's one of the, maybe the worst jobs that the staff has done in the last 20 years. Maybe that's a little bit overblown, but again, if we're going to say the roster was flawed, who is in charge of constructing the roster? And so that to me goes back to the staff as well. What were your thoughts just generally on how that went for them? What would you grade them for the season?
Yeah, I had some notes on this and I broke it down into 3 separate ways to look at this because I think you just nailed it. You have to almost like sort of categorize different elements of the season and different timelines that resulted in what happened for Michigan State this year. I think for the season as a whole, I would give them a C, not far off from what you said. Too many ups and downs. I mean, a lot of highs early. The Duke game, when everybody still thought Duke was going to be a top 25 team in the country, was, just exciting. But then as the season starts to play out, you realize that's not even that great of a win. Conference play comes, everything falls apart. And I mean, there's a point where we're all looking at it like, oh my gosh, is the tournament streak about to end? What is happening? And I think just for the sole reason of them fixing that and looking back on this and saying, okay, Michigan State still made the tournament. They still had a competitive game against a team that went to the Final Four, and they still split with Michigan.
Yeah.
is enough to look at that and call this season an objective success, even though it was a dumpster fire of a season for Michigan State standards. So I would give it a C. But I think when you break it down larger, though, like if you're looking back to the decisions that made this roster come to fruition the way it did, that is close to a failing grade. I mean, I'd probably go D- to put yourself in a position with the depth in the backcourt you had and the just revolving door at the centerpiece that was never figured out even by the final game of the season in a way that could ever lead to successful basketball.
I think that's a great point. And just touching briefly on the roster construction, obviously way too many eggs went into the Kareem Mane basket. He ends up choosing the professional route, doesn't get drafted. So maybe it would have been helpful for both parties had he come to Michigan State. There was some chatter in the transfer portal market. To see the difference between last year's portal and this year's portal, we're going to get into that a little bit, but that is something that not only Michigan State's approach, but the way that it's really transforming all of college basketball is something I want to talk about. But they just weren't aggressive enough in the market. And all you have to do is look 45 minutes down the road. What would Michigan have been had Mike Smith not been part of this group? You lose out on Joshua Christopher, you lose out on Isaiah Todd. In the long run, probably those guys, had they got integrated in, are going to create a higher upside for that roster. But in terms of fit and ability for both Smith and Chauncey Brown, like he hit it out of the park. He absolutely knocked it out of the park. He got two guys that bought into their roles. They fit perfectly. They added a veteran mix to an already kind of veteran core team, and they really rounded out the roster. And you look at what Michigan State did, Rocket Watts should have been playing backup point guard minutes in the latter half of last season. He was not. Foster Loyer was still playing in February against Nebraska, where he was really struggling. And there were moments where there was a clear, like, okay, if Rocket's going to possibly be the guy, which is a real possibility, cash is out the door, right? We know that. We've seen Foster now 2 years in a row. He cannot compete in Big Ten play at a high level. So either you get Kareem Mane or Rocket Watts is going to be your point guard. There was no prep of him. The whole offseason was spent propping Foster Loyer up. There was no public, exclamation of Rocket Watts is going to be the guy this year. He's really had a nice season, an offseason coming into this. We believe in him. There was no public trust. And to put that all on Foster Loyer, and then for us, basically 5 or 6 games in the season, once conference play really started after that initial non-conference, to go, well, Foster's still kind of the same guy. Is he a little bit better than he was? Can he run a team? Yeah, but is he going to be able to score and defend and do all the things that he needs to do in Big Ten play? The answer was clearly no, and it has been for a long time. So, I thought the way that they handled Rockets coming into this season was really, really a large part of the issue. Now, they had gave him every opportunity, in my opinion, to try to right the ship. They didn't have a point guard option. There was no real ability for them to go anywhere else but to Rocket Watts for point guard. And I know that probably was a little bit of an uncomfortable role. At some point, he asked out of it. Well, they said, okay, yeah, we'll play you at shooting guard. That lasted for like half a game, and he was right back to point guard. They didn't have a point guard on the roster. He needed to be able to be that guy. There was some spots during the course of it where he looked like his old self. But for the most part, he really had a struggle season, and I feel for the guy. But at the end of the day, again, it comes back to the way that this staff handled him and that point guard position, knowing Cash was out the door. And that was a failure, like you said.
Yeah, I mean, the Watts thing's interesting because the ability's there. It's somewhere within him as a player to be a high-level major conference starter on a good team and contribute in that way. I think, to your point, he wasn't really put in a position to succeed this year. He was asked – too much was asked of him in areas of the game that are not his strengths because of how the roster was built. And I don't blame the staff for trying to fit him into that point guard spot when your options are AJ Hoggard, who just wasn't ready early, and Foster Loyer. And, I thought Watts did admirable things at times. He shot Michigan to a loss in game 2 of that game. He was dominant in the Duke game for stretches of that game. And I'm interested to see where he ends up, because I do still believe he'll end up with a successful individual career at some point. But at the same time, we're also talking about a guy who, as much as people made it out to be a great breakthrough at the end of his freshman season, he was playing next to the best point guard in school history, an elite all-time Hall of Fame facilitator. And he still shot 38% from the floor, 28% from three, with almost as many turnovers as assists. Like, that's not winning basketball.
And if you look back at his high school career, right, he played next to LaMelo Ball, who's just doing absurd things in the NBA. I think he's banged up right now, but having a really nice start to his rookie season. So he's been the beneficiary of playing against, playing alongside really nice guys. And so perhaps some of that is what is needed for him to be successful. And I think that, there's a lot of chatter, and I see it occasionally on Twitter that, Izzo doesn't do right for the Detroit guys. All those guys end up being, broken somewhere down the line. I think that's a complete falsehood. If you look at what he gave him in terms of his freshman year, I was a little bit worried that he would try to call some of his nature, which is to go out and get buckets and to take a variety of different shots, some of them ill-advised. His freshman season, he let him shoot through an awful slump. I mean, he gave him the double green light. He let him shoot whatever he wanted to. And down the stretch, it really did end up paying dividends. He averaged just under 18 points per game the last 4 outings. Not particularly efficient basketball outside of that Illinois game, but he really gave him the freedom. The thing is, Cash left out, the door, graduated and went to, the NBA. Tillman left a year early. You're losing your 2 centerpieces on either side of the floor. Watts had to grow up. He had to grow up. He had to assume a different role. He couldn't be just that shot chucker there because he needed to run the team. And perhaps that was too great of a responsibility to put on him, and it was somewhat unfair. But at some point in time, he was going to need to be the leader of this team. Perhaps this year was just a very difficult year for him, and he wasn't capable of assuming that role. A lot of other pieces didn't really come to fruition, really outside of Aaron Henry on this roster. So it's tough to put that blame all on him. But at the end of the day, he finished with 7 double-digit outings in 28 games. Mm-hmm. You look at what he did during the course of his career. He had the second worst offensive rating on the team behind A.J. Hoggard, who could not hit a shot this year. Over his 2-year career, he boasted one of the worst recorded KenPom offensive ratings for players that took 25% or more possessions in the history of the Big Ten since KenPom recorded it, which I think it was maybe 2012 or 13. So like close to 9 years. He was not a particularly efficient guy. If I asked you, he played a total of 55 games during his career at Michigan State. How many of those games do you think he scored 15 or more points, if you had to take a guess?
Oh, boy. 10?
Yep. The answer was 9. So you're almost right there. Okay. So if you're going to be reliant on a high volume scorer to put you in games, you're also going to be relying on him to take you out when he's not playing well. And this roster was really going to go how Rocket Watts went. I, for one, was a little bit too high, and I think a lot of people were. I got a little bit lost in the finish to the season versus maybe the larger sample size. And now that we've seen it during the course of 2 years, he finished his career at MSU shooting 36.3% from the field, 26.9% from deep. I mean, I don't care who you are. Those aren't good numbers.
No.
So, I really wish him all the best. I hope that he goes to a situation where it's a little bit more aesthetically to his offensive style. I think he needs a little bit more freedom. He probably, again, needs to find a situation where he has a facilitating point guard and he can just focus on scoring. The biggest disappointment, I would say, from my perspective, wasn't so much the offensive dropout, but the defensive side of the ball. He became a real hawk towards the end of last season. That was really disappeared this particular season. And I think maybe to a certain degree, he's a guy that needed to see the ball go in to play defense. And there's guys that are just like that. But it was tough to watch on both sides of the ball this year. So despite his shooting struggles, he took the 3rd most shots on the team at 241 field goal attempts, just 6 behind Josh Langford, who was 2nd on the team. That's 103 more shots than Gabe Brown took. And we're going to get into the Gabe Brown, Josh Langford comparison. I definitely want to touch on that. But all things considered, I'll just say with his decision to answer the portal, I think that there is a certain amount of mutual beneficial to this decision. I think that the roster gets a little bit more clarity. You're going to replace his shots now with Gabe Brown getting more shots and a guy like Max Christie coming in getting more shots. And from what I've seen of his game, he is going to be a guy that can put the ball in the hole. He's going to be a much more effective shooter and scorer all around. So I think that really Michigan State is probably, to a certain degree, going to be in a situation where the roster is just going to round out a little bit better with Watts seeking another path.
Yeah, I agree. And last thing on Watts, I've said this on my show with Carter a couple times, but I've made the comparison between Rocket Watts and Jordan Poole before. Now, I think Jordan Poole is a little higher end talent, maybe a lot of higher end talent. He was able to work his way into the late first round. I don't know what Rocket Watts could necessarily do to get there, even if he had a great season. But, erratic guy who after year one, the fan base is in love with and is just projecting this guy to be all conference, projecting that he could be the leader of a great team and the go-to guy on offensive option. And to an extent, that's right. But if you're going to be that guy, you're also going to live with some really questionable shots, some defensive lapses. And Jordan Poole had the benefit of playing with another great facilitator in Xavier Simpson with a lot of other offensive options around him. Whereas Rocket Watts was basically asked to be the entire show and also play a little bit out of position. And I'm just picturing what would Jordan Poole's sophomore year have looked like had he been asked to play point guard the majority of the game, but then also kind of go back to the two guard without any true facilitator next to him. Like, it would have been a disaster. So yeah. He was put in a really tough spot. I still think he can work it out. I'm curious to see where he'll end up. But all in all, I think it's one of the most mutually beneficial departures that I can remember in quite a while.
I would agree with that. Before we get into some of the attrition that's occurred, because there's been quite a bit of offseason early movement for the Spartan lineup, I want to just touch briefly on Aaron Henry's legacy. And I'm curious what you think from this. For me, he's a guy that basically dragged this team to the tournament. I think there's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. What he did for this team in terms of leading them, I'll have to look at exactly where he ended up, but he led them in points, assists, I think rebounds. He was like second in blocks. I want to say maybe he was first in steals. He absolutely stuffed the stat sheet, and had he had a better team around him, had he a chance maybe to make a deeper run last year, if we had the 2020 tournament and he, follows up a 2019 season with another deep run in the 2020, I just feel like his legacy might have been a little bit different. I think fans were really hard on him during the course of his career. I think that some of his inconsistency that plagued him his sophomore year was, overblown to the extent that he was kind of finding a role and finding exactly what he was for that team. And then this year, he started off and basically we realized that Hauser wasn't going to quite be the guy that we thought he could be outside of, the Wisconsin game where he absolutely blows up. That was more of an anomaly than it was the norm. Rocket Watts basically completely goes, just off the radar. And so there's no help there. And Aaron Henry was basically asked to do everything. We want you to defend the best guy. We want you to score. We need you to rebound. We need you to set up other teammates. Like I can't remember a greater individual performance with less around him really of any team. And I guess Drew Neitzel maybe had one of those years. Obviously, Drew Valentine had a lot around him, and he had kind of one of those seasons where he stuffed the stat sheet. Obviously, his senior year, but that team was extremely good. He had a bunch of shooting around him. That was a completely different scenario. But in terms of just willing a team to the tournament and what he did for this program this year to keep the streak alive, to me, that was one of the more impressive individual performances. I think in a year or two, maybe three down the way, when we look back at the season with hopefully we've had a little bit more success postseason especially, I think that Aaron Henry will be viewed much more fondly by the fan base. and really just much more appreciated for what he was able to do this year for the team. What do you feel about that?
100%. I mean, I love Aaron Henry as a player. I love him as a person. I have enjoyed watching him since the moment he got on campus. I have really appreciated his individual impact over the whole course of 3 years. And I texted you the other day, but I was thinking about potentially writing something about his career. And then I ended up seeing what you and Dan collaborated on, which, again, go to SpartanHoops.com, subscribe, all of that. Make sure you get your eyes on this great piece of the best moments of his career. But the thing that resonated with me as I was brainstorming how I would try to encapsulate what Henry's career was and what his impact was when he showed up on campus, just the world in general and the Michigan State basketball program as a whole was so certain, right? Like you knew what Michigan State basketball was every year. You knew what to expect. They were this powerhouse. And Aaron Henry, of all guys, I think he was the 4th highest rated recruit in the class.
4 out of 5 out of it. Yep.
Yeah. And was he a guy that people wrote off? No. But was he a guy anyone expected to ever go down as like an all-time program great in any capacity? I don't think so. And as time goes on and the world changes and COVID happens and everything, not to get emotional here, but like everything that was certain in our lives became uncertain. And that's basketball, that's other aspects of life, that's everything. But specifically to this Michigan State team, I mean, things just disappeared that you've been able to count on for forever. Watching this Michigan State team this year was just unlike any other that you've ever seen, to the point that the fan base is just asking crazy questions and getting frustrated. And it's obviously a frustrating year, but to go from where Henry was the uncertain guy in the world of certainty to where he was this year, where he was the only thing you could ever be certain was going to show up night in and night out, was there's something special about that, I think. And I think he'll be a guy that years from now, the fan base in general really appreciates if they don't right in this moment. But I mean, smart fans do. Like, they know what he meant. And I'm excited to see what he does next, because I really do think he projects as a guy that can be a rotation level wing on a really good NBA team right away.
I'm excited to see what that happens with that, because, back end of the first round, beginning of the second, maybe a reunion with both Xavier Tillman and Jaren Jackson down. He'd be a perfect fit for the Memphis Grizzlies. Yeah, I don't know. I think that he can contribute day one, like you said. I think he's going to be a beneficiary of more spacing. I would say the development between sophomore and junior year, the biggest development that I saw was just his ability to shake a guy off the dribble and create space for himself. He was one of the best mid-range players that I can remember in recent Michigan State history. His pull-up game off the dribble in the mid-range was lethal. If we're going to complain about Josh Langford taking long twos, like, the reason why Michigan State was good was because Henry could pull up and hit a mid-range long two. And I just think that the way that he grew up, not just as a basketball player, but I watched a lot of the press conferences for him. He gave us some great quotables this year during the course of the season. And I think that he really just matured as a man. And I think if we're going to bash Izzo for having such a bad season, we also have to give him credit for developing Henry into not just the basketball player, but the human that he's become. And that really is probably why I love college basketball the most, seeing these raw young pieces come in and then be turned out into men. And to send another guy outside the top 100, it's going to be back-to-back years now, outside of the top 100 rankings, where he's going to send a guy to the NBA draft. He should be drafted. I think it's a big deal. It's a testament to the program and his ability to not only find diamonds in the rough for guys that are maybe a little bit underrated, but also to groom and develop them and then give them the not only mental but physical aspects to be able to get into the league and stick around. Because I think Xavier Tillman's going to stick around for a long time. I think Aaron Henry, if he lands in the right situation, is going to stick around for a long time. So for how much we really struggle with this season, we're frustrated as fans, we should have a great amount of appreciation for Henry, and also, what the program was able to do for him develop into the person he became, and what his laying in store for him in the NBA. Let's touch on the other attrition, because there's been quite a bit of it. I think it's all been positive myself. Obviously, we touched on the Rocket Watts thing. Josh Langford has come out today. He is retiring from basketball in general. It seems as if he's not going to try to pursue any professional career. And I think that after the journey that he's had to come in as a 5-star, to be so highly rated coming in with that original class, to then be the last remaining guy down this after 2 years where he struggled with injuries, to watch in 2019 when this team got to make a run to the Final Four to not be part of it. This season for him was a struggle in some regard on the hardwood, but I want to make sure that I respect what he did in terms of coming back and fighting and overcoming the mental and physical wall that he had to run through to be able to go through this. So before I discuss, some of what is beneficial that he doesn't return, I do want to just point that I'm grateful for everything that he gave the program, his body, his energy and effort. And I really don't think it was his fault that he wasn't so successful down to the end of the season. Again, I think there's some issue with the staff in that. But all around, he's retiring from basketball, not going to be using the extra year of eligibility that he could have technically returned. Izzo did ask him to do so. What do you think just generally about Josh Langford's journey, and kind of where do you put him when you discuss, Michigan State players during the course of it? How do you view him going forward?
Yeah, he's a really tough one to answer that question as far as his legacy goes. And I agree with you. It's almost unfair what became of Josh Langford down the stretch, because he was the butt of a bunch of jokes from the Michigan State fan base, from non-Spartan fans. I mean, certainly from me. In fact, I have one more to get off, if you don't mind, since this is the day he announced his departure. I actually taped a line beneath my feet. You can't see it here, but there's a thin line of tape, and my toes are just over the line as I sit here in Josh Langford's honor.
That's pretty good.
I'm sorry, I had to go there. But no, I mean, Josh, to me, you almost have to evaluate before the injuries, because he was a great player before the injuries, man. He really was. And I'll tell a little story here, but I'm friends with Drew Valentine, who's now Loyola's head coach. And at the time, during that recruiting class when they committed, Drew was on Michigan State staff as a graduate assistant. And so we were sharing texts. I'm all excited about this recruiting class with Bridges and Cash and all of them. And everybody's freaking out about Bridges as a whole. And I remember him being adamant and telling me to my face, you'll get hype about the dunks. Bridges will be fun. Cash is going to be cool. But Josh Langford is the guy who can have the highest ceiling career when this is all said and done. And he just loved his game. And I think there were really, really strong signs that it was going to trend that way had he just been healthy. After the injuries, not even the first injury, the second and the third injury, I mean, it's hard to even view him as the same guy. I give him credit for trying to stick it out. I also give him credit for knowing when it's time to go, because I think it would have been a little bit of a mess if he tried to come back next year. And for whatever reason, one thing you can either give credit or sometimes criticize Tom Izzo for, but he is loyal to guys that deserve his loyalty. And that's one thing you cannot take away from Josh Langford, is he earned Tom Izzo's trust in a way that I don't think many players in Spartan history have. So I wish Josh the best. I definitely enjoyed watching him, but it's tough to sort of pin down what his legacy will be.
I think that's fair. And speaking to the point regarding loyalty, I do want to touch on that eventually, because I think that there's two sides of the coin to having loyalty. And in this instance, I think that some of Izzo's individual loyalty got in the way of what needs to always be at the forefront, which is program loyalty. And we saw that with a couple guys this year. And I think that when we were looking at what Josh was possibly going to be this season, I imagined it to be a much more Kyle Arns type role, a guy who was going to come off the bench. He was going to give you 15 to 20 minutes per night. I did not expect him to, from the get-go, be the starter. And I think that, him coming back healthy, Izzo really wanted to give him the opportunity to be able to play as much as he did. And I understand that. But down the stretch, Josh's body broke down. It's really hard. And I don't know, I don't know exactly how to say this, but I think to a certain degree, he was ridden into the ground by the end of the year. And maybe that wasn't intentional. It clearly wasn't, right? It wasn't Izzo's intent to kind of wear him down, but he hadn't played in 2 years. And he ended up playing 28.5 minutes per game in conference play. That's an absolute ton to take a 2-year break to have the type of injuries in your foot that he did. Like he grabbed 15 points and snagged a career high 16 rebounds that Illinois game. He finished the rest of the conference season, including the one Big Ten tournament game against Maryland, averaging 30.8 minutes per game. He scored 8.3 points per game. He shot 35.5% on 2 field goals, 19% on 3. He took 21 threes. He shot 19%. Like, that's not good. He rode him to the point where he wasn't usable down the stretch for the minutes that he wanted to play. And I'm just not sure, when we look back on this, I think that what we saw was maybe some frustration on Josh's part that he couldn't be the guy that he used to be, that he obviously had a desire to do that. But I also think that there was a slight mishandling of that player that you were trying to give an opportunity to, but down the stretch, you didn't do a good job of protecting him, right? It's a weird line that he was trying to toe, and I think that it almost went too far in one way where, Josh needed to play less. I don't know how else to say it. He needed to play less so that when he was on there, he was more impactful. And it was almost like he didn't quite know who to turn to. But I thought that answer was very clearly Gabe Brown. And I want to touch on it briefly, but we just have to kind of look at the total breakdown. So Josh Langford played 757 minutes this season. Gabe Brown played 517. That's 240 minutes less. Roughly 6 entire games more Josh Langford played. Like, Gabe Brown is a healthy, 6'8" athletic wing. He's an upperclassman, so it's not like he's like a younger guy. He should be given some of his due, which he hasn't quite, gotten to. The total shots were 247 to 138. He took 109 less shots than Josh Langford. Josh Langford shot 37.7% from the field. Gabe Brown shot 47.1%. Like, that's not a small percentage difference. The 3-point line, which is really kind of where both of them should have been making their money. Gabe Brown was 34 for 81, 42%. Josh Langford was 35 for 102, 34.3%. So he took basically 21 more shots to make one more shot than Gabe Brown did during the course of the season. And the at the rim percentages are similar, 60% for Gabe, 50% from Josh. The other 2 field goals, Gabe Brown shot 48.1%, and Josh Langford in the mid-range shot 36.4%. So at every single level of the floor, Gabe Brown was a more efficient player. If you want to say maybe Josh moved the ball better, he's a little bit assist man, I don't think there's any dispute there. But in terms of defensive-wise, again, Gabe Brown is probably your better defender, your better rebounder in the long term if you played him the same amount of minutes. And if you look at the efficiency rating, Josh Langford was the second worst efficient player on the team with 40% minutes allotted. AJ Holgert obviously didn't qualify that. So out of the 2 guys that played at least 40% or more of the minutes, Rocket Watts was the worst efficient guy, and Josh Langford was second. Of guys who played 40% or more minutes, Gabe Brown was the most efficient player on this team for Ken Palm's rating. So when you look at the whole big picture, there was an overplaying of Josh Langford to the detriment of not only Gabe Brown individually, but the roster as a whole. So when you look at that and we speak of individual loyalty, we speak of loyalty, yes, Josh Langford deserved an opportunity to be able to, play again after having such a long hiatus, but it can't come at the detriment to the rest of the roster, and particularly guys that you're grooming to be, hopefully NBA upside players heading into his senior season. So what do you quite make of that kind of allotment for the minutes? Would you like to see more Gabe Brown? What's your general feel on that?
Yeah, I was waving the play Gabe Brown flag very early. I have pretty much since he stepped on campus. Like I'm also a sucker for shooters. If you haven't listened to me before, don't know what my ideals are. Like I want as much shooting on the floor at all times as possible, and Gabe certainly can do that. I also I'll trust your expertise that Gabe was probably a better defender than Josh, but I think from my interpretation of how the staff saw it, I think they view Josh as a guy who will at least always be in the right spot and always know where to be, almost
It
in a
doesn't
weird
help if
way.
you getting blow by, though. If you can't
Right. But
stop anybody off the dribble, what difference does it make if you're in the right spot when you literally can't move laterally quick enough to stop it?
right. And that's where I think the staff gets the failing grade because I think they view Josh the same way they almost view Kithier of he'll be in the right spot when I think Izzo's literally said that in press conferences. Like, you don't got to worry about Thomas. Well, you do when he's guarding a 6'11 guy that can go to work in the post because there's nothing he can do, even if he's in the right spot. And that's what you saw with Josh on the perimeter this season. But I do think the other thing here is on the offensive end, the team needed guys who could create shots. And as good of a shooter as Gabe Brown is, he doesn't have that yet. I don't know if he will, but with the way, again, the roster construction, it's like Henry's got to do it, or Rocket Watts has to do it, or AJ Hogarth's going to do it for someone, but not himself. But that's really the three guys, as far as perimeter guys go, who could do anything. And then you've got Josh Langford, who at least can get his one dribble pull up whenever he wants. And as inefficient as that shot became, and as much of a joke as it was, he got that shot in a lot of games. And sometimes with the Michigan State offense this year, that was more than you could say for when their struggles were really going. So I don't know. I think there's a better distribution than what they landed on. It would have included a lot more Gabe Brown. But again, a lot of these problems go away as soon as you've got somebody in the backcourt who is just a high quality facilitator.
We froze up a little bit there, so the broadcast might get a little wonky, but we'll cut that out and we'll see if we can figure it out.
That's all right. Yeah, I finished my spiel and I looked and I'm like, oh, shit.
No, I know. I saw we were frozen there for a second. That's all right. This is the first time production. We're going to get it right. I agree with you to a certain point. I guess my one counter to that would be, why wasn't Gabe Brown being given more sets run, right? We saw a lot of little pin downs for Josh coming off in the middle and having those elbow jumpers or kind of the elbow extended in the mid range. Those shots could have easily been drawn up for Gabe Brown. And while, yes, I agree with you, Josh was a little bit better about putting on the deck and then pulling up. Again, that wasn't exactly the best shot for the roster. And sometimes that shot was as good as a turnover. So it was a little bit of a struggle there, but all around, his departure gives more ability for Brown to not have to worry about looking over his shoulder to be the guy next year. And I think that that's all around a good thing for the roster. You touched on Thomas Kithier. Kithier had kind of the brunt of a lot of Michigan State fans' ire this season. If you look at the KenPom numbers, he actually was an extremely efficient. He was the most efficient player on the team. Obviously, he didn't play quite the minutes that a lot of guys did. I think the real issue that you saw is you were asking him to play in the center spot when he wasn't capable of doing that. And the pairing of Hauser and Kithier together, which happened the first 14 games of the season, I went back and looked at that. That was, if I'm taking one thing to really complain about the staff, the point guard botching, eventually they had Watts start though, and that kind of went from there. But the decision to start Kithier, not only to start him, but to start him next to Hauser for 14 games in the season, to think that that was going to be your best way to start a game, that was baffling. It was completely stubborn. The way that Kithier was used towards the end of the season when he was the fourth option, and what we had was Marble softening up a guy, Bingham coming in and giving some length, then Sissoko giving you a little run, and Kithier getting 2 to 3 minute stretches kind of at the end of the first half and then maybe midway through the second. That's the perfect use for him. He's a useful guy in the rotation. But the way that they started playing him and, the reliance on him to play and somehow, that had to be one of the worst front court defensive pairings that Michigan State has ever put on the floor. I didn't understand that at all. I think that was the worst part of the rotational decisions throughout this year. And that's not on Thomas Kithier. He can't decide whether he's starting or not, so I have a little bit of sympathy in my heart. I'm glad that he's going to Valpo. I hope that he has a successful year next year. I really do. But at the same time, removing that temptation from the roster and from Izzo is a very good thing.
For sure. Yeah, and I think, Kithier had offers to stay at a high major with this transfer.
Do you think Fife really tried to bring him to Indiana? Are those true?
Probably, dude. I won't put that past Dane Fife at this point. I won't. And that's a conversation for a later day. But, that's his guy. He's Clarkston,
I guess so. Well, let's touch on that right now. What did you think regarding Dane Fife leaving for Indiana? Obviously, Doug Wojcik gets the tap in. Give me your thoughts on that, and I'll then return my own.
Yeah, I mean, okay, unfiltered. It's good to see Fife go. It is. I don't know what he was necessarily bringing to Michigan State other than experience at this point. He obviously was highly responsible and highly involved in the two Clarkston guys ending up at Michigan State. I don't want to necessarily assume too much that I don't know. Maybe you know more, but not only did he get those guys to Michigan State, but they also stayed in roles that after their early season, they maybe didn't show that they deserved. And that also came into implications with how they recruited those positions. And it didn't feel like they were really after any high level replacements for those guys. And that came back to bite them this year. So God bless him. Good luck to him at Indiana. But I think objectively, that's a win for the Michigan State program at this point. That said, I wasn't rooting for Wojcik to get the promotion. I don't think many Michigan State fans were from what I've seen. I think everybody at this point is probably just waiting for the day where a little youth is injected into the program, which, might not come under Tom Izzo, to be frank. He doesn't really do things that way. So I think, with Drew Valentine as an option before Loyola became available, I can almost guarantee you he would have gotten a call. Timing didn't work out.
I know that he would have. I was told by someone within the program that was the number one option, and the timing obviously didn't end up working out. Great for Drew to be able to, for him to be able to go and get a chance at Loyola to build a program, that's been really successful the last couple of years to continue it on. So maybe it's one of those situations where long-term, when Izzo decides to hang it up, if Stevens is not the guy, maybe, Valentine has had some years of experience. Maybe it's not going to quite be enough. But I think you're right? To a certain degree. Let me ask you this. How many years, if you were a betting man, what do you put in the over-under on years that Izzo remains the head coach at Michigan State?
Dude, I've bet the under too many times before to make this mistake again. I mean, years ago, 5 years ago, when I'm looking at the way he's recruiting, early in Cash's career, I'm like, he's not really recruiting another point guard right now. This kind of feels like this is going to be his going away party, this senior class with Winston and with Langford. And then COVID happens. Who knows if that was it or not? I'll also say Steven, his son is on the team now. I'm sure everybody knows that. I went to high school with Steven. Well, not at the same time, but I went to high school with his older sister, Rocky. So I've been around the Izzo family, and the age of his kids is something that I'm sort of taking into consideration here. You saw this with Mark D'Antonio. His kids graduated college, and shortly thereafter, he was gone. So I don't know. I've bet the under. I've said I think, maybe in the next 5 years. But at this point, I'll be shocked because Tom seems to still have the heart for it. He still seems to be high energy. He's got a banger recruiting class coming in. He's regrouped. He's rebuilt, and it's reloaded. So I would say, if I had to throw a number, I don't know. Is it under 7 or 8 at this point? Is that too little?
No, I don't know. I've kind of pegged it in my mind as somewhere around 4 to 5. But, I think a lot of things can happen. If he somehow gets over the hump and wins a national title, the second one, which is elusive, it's the Moby Dick that he's chasing. I think that he can ride off into the sunset. But if he doesn't get that and he gets close again and it's right there dangling, he's a guy that just he wants that. He wants it so bad. Obviously, everybody wants it for him as well as the program. But I think it depends. It's going to be almost a season by season review and see kind of how this thing plays out. But all around, I agree with you. Wojcik, ran into some issues at the last program he's at. I think people are familiar with that. Having another tough, hard-nosed coach alongside Izzo doesn't exactly preach a balance of personalities. I would have liked to see a little bit more of an injection in youth. I hope somewhere down the line that gets tapped. But my understanding is he feels extremely good about Wojcik, not only as a coach and somebody that he can bounce ideas off of, but also in the recruiting department. And we saw that this week. Isaac Trout gets offered a class of 22, and Wojcik is the lead recruiter there. He gets the official visit, which is set from June 17th to 19th. We actually have an Isaac Trout interview that's going to be coming down the pipeline in the next week or two. We'll get that article up. It's scheduled for later this week. Really interesting prospect for him. And just touching generally, I think that obviously we're really excited about the 21 class. The 22 class, he has kind of cast a little bit of a small net. And it worries me to a certain degree because he came out, he absolutely hit a home run in 21. It could potentially be just like a grand slam if somehow Amani Bates was reclassified. I'm still not going to hold my breath on that. We'll have to see kind of how that shakes out. But I think that you need to back that up with a really strong 22 class. Like if this is kind of the twilight of your career, the end part of your career, then you need to finish it recruiting strongly to put yourself in a position to be able to win. And with the portal kind of changing some of that, we saw them aggressively identify Tyson Walker. The rumors are that they were recruiting head-to-head with Kansas on that one. They ended up landing him. The pitch is essentially that he could come in and be a guy like Cassius Winston. He's 6 feet. He's like 165 pounds. He's a little bit slighter, but he's much quicker than Cash is. Probably not quite the shooter, but he ranked 13th nationally in points generated out of the pick and roll. So I really imagine that the type of offense that we saw with Cash and Tillman kind of down the stretch in 2019 and into 2020, I think that we see a little version of that again. And so it'll be interesting to see. Obviously, you never know with an up transfer like that what he's going to be able to provide you. But I just think that the way that they went out and approached it, it showed a willingness to adapt, which I wasn't sure. And then you look at the transfers that end up happening. In my opinion, really now there's only one other guy that you really would possibly hope would remove another temptation from the roster and kind of just strengthen the ability to, okay, who's at the scorer's table right now? Who's coming to check in who? If one other person leaves this roster, there's not a guy on it that I would be like, oh God, there he is. He's coming to the table again. There won't be anybody on the roster that's like that. And I think that generally for how much Tom Izzo likes to win, I think that he hates losing maybe as much, if not more. I think that this season probably sat in his craw. If you're a fan and you felt sick or frustrated about the season, imagine a guy who spent the better part of his career winning and having this kind of season towards the end of his career. Like he has got to be so hungry for this coming into the offseason that I think all around that we're going to see some changing. We're going to see, some willingness to be adaptable, but he really has to come back. And to kind of tie this all around, he's got to come back and really hit it out of the park in the 22 or utilize the portal again to round out the roster. Because I think that, he's thrown his hat into the ring on a couple prospects with a lot of big name schools. If they miss on a couple of these guys, they don't really have much in the way of backup plans. And it worries me a little bit because they've gotten themselves into these situations before for some classes where they've taken backup guys. And then when those guys get older, you realize, oh, this wasn't such a good class. Kind of a little bit what we've seen with the 2018.
Yeah, no, 100%. I think special things happen at a program and just specific teams wise when you string together a couple special classes in a row. And you saw that with the Bridges, Winston, Langford, Ward class, followed most importantly by Jaron Jackson, Xavier Tillman.
Yeah.
And I mean, there were other guys in those classes too, don't get me wrong, but like that's the high end talent that gets you to a championship level basketball team. The NCAA tournament's a wild card. It always is. Great championship level teams don't always make the second weekend. That happened. Then they make their Final Four run with a couple guys that stuck around after a couple went pro. And that's the formula in today's day and age, is you need that high level talent. I think he's got a class this year that everyone agrees can be the foundation of a championship team. The question is he going to add to it, and is he going to fill in around it in the right ways? I think as a Spartan fan, if you're looking at the way they're approaching 22 right now, you're probably a little nervous about that, because there hasn't been that consistency on the recruiting trail the last 4 or 5 years, and that's kind of how you found yourself in the spot you were this season. Now, just having a couple guys like Akins and Brooks theoretically around should raise the floor enough that even if you don't bring in a couple of the high-end level guys, you've got enough pieces foundationally that the team should be all right. But if you're chasing that championship, which we both agree Tom Izzo's in it to win it, otherwise he wouldn't still be in it, we got to see something shake in 22. So we'll see.
Yeah, we will. And the biggest need is obviously in the front court. They're in on a couple guys. Terrace Reed Jr. just got offered by Kansas. He's a St. Louis kid. He's a guy that I'm extremely high on. I think if you've looked at kind of what the roster has been missing and kind of almost a transition back in the Big Ten Conference, you look at what Hunter Dickinson was able to do, taking the pressure off an offense by being able to dump the ball in and have a guy go get a 2. Michigan State hasn't really had that since Nick Ward. And Xavier Tillman, for everything that he was, a great, great basketball player, great mind, great defender, wasn't exactly that guy either. So I think that this class in particular, I'm a big fan of Jalen Washington, who they're high on. They, to my understanding, believe he can be like a Jaren Jackson type. He came off a knee injury. He's a guy that is extremely long and lengthy. He's a shooter. I think that he's probably going to be a high 30 shooter in college. Can he get some of his lateral mobility back? I've seen some recent clips where it looks like some of that is returning, but he's a guy that's a really, really good shooter. If you could get him and then pair him with a guy that can go get you a bucket, like down in the post, like a Terrace Reed can, I mean, then you're really talking about, okay, so Christie is probably a 2-year guy, comes back. Then we got Akins. Then we're looking at the rest of the roster, and you have maybe Malik Hall as a senior here. Matty Sissoko is now a junior. You added some front court depth. Like, if you add enough weapons on this team, the goal in college basketball is to give yourselves as many shots as possible in consecutive years, cracks at the apple. And I think that if you look down the road with what Juwan Howard has been able to do, that is who you're competing against. And for, some of the jokes that were made when he first came in and some of, the shade that was thrown on him, that's gotten real quiet from Michigan State fans. And he has come in and he's shown the ability to not only coach, but to recruit. He's getting a really nice class coming in. He's going to land another nice one in the next year because Jet Howard is down at IMG and he's going to have his pick of at least a couple of those guys that he plays with. He's going to continue to turn out really nice classes. And I think that Tom Izzo is going to actually be a beneficiary of that because he's looking down the road and seeing what's going on and saying, this is the end of my career. Am I going to let this guy come in and out recruit me and possibly have more shots and cracks at Final Four opportunities, at national championship opportunities than me? So I think there's a lot of benefit to Juwan actually coming in. I think that the way that he's been able to recruit and consistently grab a bunch of guys from all over the country, widening the net, I would like to see Michigan State do a little bit more of that. I know they're going to always be a little bit more selective, but identifying guys, pushing all in, and really ensuring that you're getting high-level guys in back-to-back classes to kind of finish out his career is going to be crucial whether he gets an opportunity at a chance for another national title.
Yeah, 100%. I think, there's formulas to all this. And with the way the transfer portal and the rules of college basketball are evolving, like finding a plug-and-play guy who's an all-conference player at a high major is not going to be overly difficult in the future. And that's crazy. It's evolving and it's new, but if the staff can figure that out on the fly and fill in, I mean, Tyson Walker isn't a high major guy, but he's going to be And there's guys like that out there, and they'll evolve and they'll fill in. I think your point about Juwan is an interesting one for sure. I think like doubting Tom Izzo is not something anyone should ever do. And I know it's bit me in the ass before doing that. Like I've certainly gone on record criticizing him and doubting and saying, oh, is this going to be the end? Just don't do it. Like the man is innately motivated by just this intrinsic desire to avoid losing. Like you said, like he's so competitive. And no matter what happens, like you could give him this roster he just had this season again and keep giving Juwan 5-star after 5-star. I bet you Tom Izzo is still going to find a way to split. Like, that's where my head is at with this rivalry at this point. I can't believe this Michigan State team took a game from that Michigan team. And I know Eli Brooks went down, but, like, I just can't get over that. And even you go back a couple years ago, like Michigan with the Iggy Brezdeikis team, they lose 3 times to a state team that ends up going to the Final Four. But that was one of Michigan's highest talented teams John Beilein ever had. And Izzo just finds a way, man. It's what he does. So it'll be interesting. On the flip side of that, I do just want to say, I mean, as coaches get up there in age, in college basketball especially, how often when they get really up there in age does it end on a high note, though? Not much. That's the thing. And I'm not saying it can't happen or it won't happen. Right now, he's bringing in the players to make it happen. So he's going to have more runs in him. But knowing how stubborn he is, if he wants to stick around another decade, I mean, I don't know that I can even name a guy who got up into his 70s that was winning at that high level at that age and went out on top, you know?
What's K right now? Obviously, it's a different program completely.
Yeah.
The way that he's turned it and recruited. But how old is K?
K's older than Izzo. He's probably
Izzo's 66. I think K is in his 70s now.
He's got to be in 70s. But yeah, I don't know. That thought literally came up as you were talking about it, and I'm just like,
so Coach K is 74, and so he won in 2015. Is that the last one?
Did they win it? Yeah, they won in 15.
Yeah, that was the year that they beat Wisconsin.
So let me ask you this: Coach K is 74. He sticks around 6 more years. Do you think he gets another Final Four?
I think he's done in a year or two. I think he's almost on his way out, in my opinion. So I don't think that conversation happens. But he's going to have potentially a really nice squad maybe this year. Paolo Banchero is a real deal. So that's going to be interesting to see. You know, that again, it goes back to recruiting. If you give yourself enough high-level guys mixed in with some vets, then you give yourself an opportunity to do a crack at it. And that's really what Michigan State's focus got to be. I think more so than anything, you have got to hit the next 2 or 3 recruiting classes hard, or you hit the portal, like you said, because it's a completely different ball game. You could fill out a roster from the portal right now that could probably finish in the top half of the conference. That's how many guys are in the portal. That's how much talent is in there. And this is the beginning. This is not the end of how this is going to be. They passed the 1-year portal rule. I think that they're probably going to continue to maybe do that, or at least have a little bit more leeway with some of these transfers and the ability to be able to round out your roster with a veteran guy that's played, whether it's low major, mid major, high major, and seen some production on the college level and seen if you can integrate that guy into the system. It's changing the way that college basketball is going to be recruited, and it's going to be fascinating. Well, let's kind of move on here a little bit from Michigan State. We'll kind of wrap up with them again, but we're already at an hour here. We'll probably go another 20 or 30. This is the first one we've done in a while. There's obviously a lot to talk about, so appreciate the fans who are still sticking with us here. Let's transition into Michigan and just generally your rooting interests, which will probably make a lot of fans throw up at some point. I mean, we're going to have to shame you a little bit on this podcast for it.
Sure.
You were a Michigan State grad, but
Correct.
You're a Michigan fan. So please explain to the people what happened, what Michigan State did to make you abandon them and turn your coat. Tell us, please.
This is the segment everyone waited an hour for, DK. This is what everybody came here for. Look, okay, I've got one more shtick for you. I wore my shirt. Zoom in on the camera here. It says "Come Together," because that's what I'm asking the Michigan fans and the Michigan State fans to do right now. Rather than come together to say we hate this guy, I'm hoping you come together and say Okay, we can kind of maybe respect it or at least get it, even if we don't respect
We're not going to respect your decision, but I'll
respect
say this. I respect your knowledge of the college basketball game. I respect the knowledge that you have of both Michigan and Michigan State. Like, I'll never understand what a mutant you are in terms of your rooting interests.
Sure.
But I generally respect your opinion. And so, I can live with that. I mean, I just consider you a Michigan fan, and I try to forget that you went to Michigan State and didn't enjoy the best 4 years of your life there, and then somehow on the
see,
board.
you got to draw the line there. There was the 4 best years of my life. And let me try to explain. Here's the best I can do. Grew up in East Lansing, 10 minutes from campus, Michigan fan. Dad's a Michigan alum, just grew to love the game of basketball, happened to be coming up as John Beilein starts to get hired and I get serious about watching basketball. I don't know how much people listening to this know about John Beilein. I'd assume a decent amount. It's really hard to root against or hate that guy. He's just a lovable dude. Like, he's the pure old grandpa who just was so anti-cheating and anti the bad things of college basketball and somehow was super successful at a program that hadn't been for 25 years. Anyway, I go to apply for college at the time. I apply to Michigan. I apply to Michigan State. I get into both. I visit Michigan thinking I'm going to go to Michigan. And I'll be honest, I was rubbed so the wrong way by just the arrogance of everybody there. Like, I couldn't take it.
I cannot wait till Carter hears this. This is going to be great.
It's true. He's heard it in person, dude. Like, my close friends have heard this story. It is what it is. And I'm not saying I hate Michigan alums or anything like that, but like, there was an air of arrogance to it all that I couldn't get down with. And so it was a hard call because I was a Michigan fan who fully expected to go to Michigan, but I visited Michigan State. I've been there my whole life, living 10 minutes from campus, and made the decision to go to MSU. Loved every second. Was a 4-year ISON member. Happened to be there for 4 of the most successful years in football and basketball.
Years were you there?
11 through 15.
Oh my God.
I mean, we saw a Final Four, we saw a Rose Bowl, we saw Big Ten championships of all kinds. It was an electric time to be a Spartan. So that said, hate me for it if you want. The Wolverine basketball fan in me never disappeared. Now, I will not ever go out and root for Michigan football. I cannot support anything Jim Harbaugh related. That man baffles me in all ways. But maybe it's the Beilein effect. I don't know. The Michigan fandom for basketball never left. So that leaves me in a spot where I watch both teams. I watch every game. I love both teams. I can look in the camera and be honest.
Strong word. I don't know if I believe that.
It's true. I love both teams. I definitely lean the Wolverine side when I'm evaluating basketball in general. And there's reasons for that I won't bring up on this podcast. But I am a Spartan. I am a Spartan fan as well. And it is what it is. I'm a mutant and nobody loves me, DK.
I love you. I love you. That's why I have you do the podcast. So we can forgive you for it. I mean, okay. I think that you appeased enough of the Michigan State fan base in regards to your comments regarding Michigan fans generally, where you're probably going to get thrown a bone there. And I get it. If you grew up a fan of one sport and, you lived around the corner from it, it's hard to pass that up. So I'm with you. I get it. I don't quite understand it. After 4 years, I think I would have just flipped the switch, but it's understandable.
I tried.
I mean, it's a great time to be a Michigan basketball fan. All these fans coming out of the woodworks that have been ride or die on the football, they're all hopping on the bandwagon, pretending they've been there for 10 years through the pain and the suffering in the beginning of the Beilein era. That's like 5 to 10% of the fan base. I have a couple of good friends that are Michigan fans that have been ride or die since the Beilein era, praying for better times. They got it. And now they're at a spot where, Juwan Howard has the ability to bring them a national title. And, it pains me to say that. There's nothing that makes me feel good to say that. But if you were going to ask me right here and now in the next 5 years, who's more likely to win one, I don't know. It's really hard to do. It's really, really hard to do. And I think that all the Michigan fans who were throwing shade on Twitter over the years about the Final Four banners and shit, well, that'd be real nice to be hanging one this year, wouldn't it, boys? It'd be real nice. But guess what? Final Four banners are hard to hang.
Hey, listen.
It's a crazy concept. It really is. For a fan base that hasn't hung nearly as many as us, for them to throw shade and nonstop and say, you're the fourth place loser if you don't make it into the national championship game. Sorry, we didn't play Chicago Loyola a couple of years back.
Oh.
Sorry about that.
Listen, this is the best rivalry. If the way to consolidate me in all of this, I'm the champion of the rivalry, man. I believe this is the greatest rivalry in sports, and the hatred from both sides is a beautiful thing. And one day, these two teams that are elite basketball programs in this day and age are going to meet in the NCAA tournament, and I'm probably going to have a heart attack, as are whoever fans, whatever losing team's fans do too. But like you said, Juwan's got him in a good spot right now. Final Fours are hard to come by. Sweet 16s are also hard to come by every now and then.
There it is. There's the shade.
It is what it is.
I like it. All right. Well, let's just touch briefly on Michigan then here. Eli Brooks back in the fold. Mike Smith gone. Chauncey Brown gone. They're probably still possibly pursuing another transfer guard, from my understanding. Jacob Young's been in the mix. Obviously, Michigan fans would really like to maybe see Marcus Carr's name floated a little bit, and that was floated in the beginning. We haven't seen much smoke about that recently. I think that he probably takes a longer time and pursues the professional option. It's a little bit tough, if you feel okay about the roster. I'm high on the freshman. Let me start that. I'm a Frankie Collins guy. I've watched him maybe 3 or 4 full games. I think that he has the potential to really be explosive. He's an athlete. He's a guy that's going to be able to get downhill and create immediately. How good he's going to be is determined on his jump shot evolving, because eventually guys are just going to give him space. And if they're athletic enough, they're going to kind of bottle him up and give him a few feet and dare him to shoot. It'll be interesting for me to see kind of how that evolves. But in terms of pure athleticism, he's going to be a guy that's as athletic at the point guard spot as anybody that's been seen in the Big Ten recently. So do they go out and maybe add another guy? I'm not personally high on Eli Brooks running much more than maybe 10 minutes a game at the point guard spot. This idea that he somehow is going to come back and play, 20, 25 minutes at the point guard spot, I'm not crazy about it for me personally. If you're talking about what that team was last year, it was a national championship front court when healthy, with Livers and Wagner and Dickinson, and the back court was middle of the conference. Maybe that's kind of how I feel about it. It was not a national championship type backcourt. It just wasn't. Mike Smith was a hell of a player when he got into the latter part of the season, and he was scouted a little bit more heavily. He struggled with a little bigger, longer athletes. I think Eli Brooks and his defensive accolades that he's received during the course of the career were a little overstated. I think with quicker guards and bigger, stronger guys, he looked like he struggled a little bit down the stretch. And so for me, I like that Brooks is coming back because you add some continuity to the younger and very talented group of Frankie Collins, Buffkin. You still have Zeb Jackson in the rotation. Hopefully he's, a little bit more settled after playing a year. You have a guy, what's Barnes' first name? Isaiah? Is that
Isaiah
right?
Barnes.
Yeah. So they have a bunch of talented guys coming in. If they want to be competing for a national title again, I think that you probably want to add one more veteran piece to that mix. But now we're running into a balance of what do we do in terms of limiting the guys that you really want to say eventually play and eventually give you another crack at having a very talented backcourt, but they're young? Or do you add a guy and just say, we've got maybe one more year of Hunter Dickinson left. He's a potential All-American, first All-American candidate. Can we get him and Diabate and Houston all going in the right direction? We need to add a veteran guard and make another swing at this. Where do you kind of stand on what they should do again in the transfer market and how the roster's shaking out?
Yeah, I think you summarized a lot of things perfectly spot on. But before I address everything you said perfectly, I need you to name me 3 backcourts in the Big Ten that are better than Eli Brooks and Mike Smith.
That were last year?
Yeah. Because that was not a middle of the conference backcourt. There's a difference between a non-national title backcourt and a middle of the Big Ten. That was still upper tier. They just couldn't create shots at a level that was going to get them to a title.
It's tough for me to say because take away the wings from them, and what does that backcourt look like? Like,
I mean, Mike Smith led the conference in assists per game.
yeah, and he had two NBA guys on the
Don't
wings
give
for
me the
most of the
Mickey
season, and
Mouse
he has a
assist
future
thing.
NBA
Like
player down in the post.
he was great out of the pick.
I think he was great. I'm not trying to diminish what he did. I just think down the stretch, he really was the beneficiary of having a ton of different talent around him. There's no doubt about that. Like if you would have run it back this year with Mike Smith and Eli Brooks, and you had, kind of the wing group around that you have this year, would he has been as good, as productive? I'm not 100% certain on that.
That's fair. I mean, other than Illinois and maybe Ohio State, if you want to take Dwayne Washington when he's going nuclear, and I guess Marcus Carr individually, the Brooks Smith combo contributed in a big way. Yes, it was the front court that was the talent, but Mike Smith was phenomenal out of pick and rolls. And Eli is really, I think, everything you're hoping Gabe Brown is, even though they're totally different players. Like, he's a purely off-ball guy who's just going to be ridiculously efficient. And I think you're right about Eli that defensively his whatever you want to call it, his prestige is overrated. I agree. I just watched Johnny Juzang baptize that man for 40 minutes, and our top 20, pick, supposedly Franz Wagner, not even get switched on to him once. So
I didn't understand that. I didn't understand that at all.
It was strange, man. I'm surprised there wasn't a lot more outrage out of that. Definitely a questionable call from Juwan, but yeah, I don't know. I think Eli and fans in general, to transition to the rest of how you set me up here. Eli back is objectively a great thing. It is. Yes. Anytime you can get a fifth-year senior who shoots 40% from three, 50% from the floor, and is a good to maybe fringe great defender against guys his size, you take that. That said, Eli can't run point on a national title team. Eli can't create shots for himself or others at a level for a backcourt player for a national title team. Eli is, to compare, maybe a poor man's Muhammad Ali Abdur-Rahman from a couple years ago. And that entire year, I'm here standing, get Jordan Poole on the court. Get the NBA guy on the court. Let him make a bucket. Like, that's what Michigan needs right now. And they're in a really tough spot to figure out how to handle this because, man, 5 guys in a backcourt is not a problem when 2 or 3 of those guys aren't expecting minutes. But when you've got a McDonald's All-American in Kobe Buffkin, a top 50 recruit in Frankie Collins, who I've been referring to as Jumbo Darius Morris, even though he's smaller than Darius Morris, he just plays like he's bigger than Darius Morris. And then Eli Brooks, who's played 35 minutes 2 straight years a game. And then Zeb Jackson, who was a top 100 recruit, who right now seems to be the guy everybody's just ready to let go and write him off, and we don't want him in the rotation.
That's crazy to me. The fan base willingness to move on for a guy who spent a year in the program and has learned. I'll say this. Michigan fans had a bit of laughter regarding the rotation this year for Michigan State. It was too deep. Obviously, the wrong guys played. There's no disagreement from my angle. Michigan is going to run into a situation where they have the ability to play 10 plus guys maybe next year. So Juwan, out of necessity, was able to play 7 or 8 guys and shorten a rotation. Well, now you got a bunch of guys that you got to figure out. And if I had one qualm, with the way that the rotation was handled this year, I get that maybe Zeb didn't always look like he belonged on the court outside of maybe that like Ohio State game where he hits a couple threes and you see some flashes from him. He needed more opportunity in the beginning of the season. I get it was a condensed non-conference schedule. He needed more opportunity against weaker opponents to be able to develop some confidence and just see what you had a little bit. Like, do you even really know what you have in him? Like, now he's spent a year in the system. I get he was a Beeline guy. He wasn't a Howard guy. But to a certain degree, I think that I would have liked to maybe see a little bit more of that. And to just assume that you're going to have these guys come in that were around the top 50 and, be ready to go right from the get-go to play in the Big Ten. Like, yes, maybe like a guy like Houston. Yeah, I believe that he's going to be ready from day one. Can Diabate, who's like a physical and athletic specimen, be ready day one? But if you're going to turn over the reins, at some point in time to Frankie Collins year one, there's going to be some struggles there. There's going to be some inconsistency. And the same can be said for Kobe Buffkin, who I was extremely high on, but fractured his wrist and didn't finish much of this last season. He's coming off an injury. He didn't get to really play his senior year. I don't think that that's being spoken enough about. I think that getting these guys up to speed is going to be a little bit more of a journey than people think. I think it's an extremely, extremely talented class coming in, but just to expect them to hit, 0 to 100 the moment they enter into class, I think that is going to be tough. And so it'll be interesting for me to see how it shakes out. But I think all around, maybe adding one more piece would be helpful somewhere along. And I don't know if that's a point guard. I'm not sure if that's, like a ball handling combo guard that maybe shoots well behind the arc. What do you think in terms of if you could add one more piece to the mix, who would that be for you?
So it's a really interesting discussion. They're going to add a guy. They're going to add a backcourt body. There's enough rumblings that they're chasing guys right now. Originally, it was they're going to go after Marcus Carr. I think they realize that's not realistic at this point, so there's not really anything happening there. The two names that are thrown around heavily right now are Jacob Young from Rutgers and Jalen Pickett from Siena. I have been fighting Michigan fans for 2 weeks now on this. God forbid if any of them are listening to the Spartan Hoops podcast. I doubt it. But if they do, they're going to be like, who is this guy right now? But I've been fighting all week because I don't want Jacob Young on this Michigan roster. I think Jacob Young is a non-NBA guy, a non-all-conference guy who is erratic, is a chucker, who is supposedly supposed to be this defensive pest who can come in and will be a lot better in a better system. Maybe, I guess, but are you telling me we're going to have a backcourt of Jacob Young and Eli Brooks, two guys who are going to really expect 30 minutes a game, and neither one of them have a future in the NBA, and neither one of them are all conference players? And that's supposed to leave me with our really highly promising freshman class with 20 minutes between the two of them and Zach Jackson?
Bingo.
That's just dicey. So I'm a huge advocate of if you can get a guy who really raises the ceiling to this is maybe a top 2 team in the country at the beginning of the year, you do it. But there's nobody like that in the portal right now other than Marcus Carr. Jalen Pickett from Siena is more appealing to me because, one, he's a more consistent shooter. He's a really efficient guy. He's a high assist to turnover guy. And he's also a guy that's been on NBA radars. He was a fringe, could he get drafted even as a one and done, sneak into the second round after his first year at Siena. He had some injury issues and also was out with COVID this year, so it hurt his numbers a bit. But he's 6'4". He could theoretically play the 1, 2, or the 3 a bit and just be a really cerebral, high-level smart player who can knock down shots. So I like that more. That feels like it's a little bit less of a guy coming in demanding 30 minutes who's been a Big Ten player before versus this is a guy you could plug and play wherever depending on how the freshmen look. But I'm also super high on this freshman class in a way that I think you are and everybody on the Michigan State fan side should be. There's something to be said about really talented kids having a huge opportunity right away. And Max Christie is that. I think, like you said, Caleb Houston will be that, and he's a plug-and-play role guy who can step into Isaiah Livers' role and get his shots, and it'll be great. There's a little gray area with shot creators. What is Frankie Collins going to look like right away? What is Kobe Buffkin going to look right away off the injury? That's fair, but 4 bodies is a lot, and really with Eli back, you really only need one of these guys to be a high-level starter right away. And I can tell you, I'll be really frustrated as a fan if they find a fill-in who blocks that from happening, and that fill-in's not an NBA guy or an all-conference Big Ten player.
I think that all points you made are fair. If you have a guy that takes you and raises your ceiling dramatically, you do it. If you don't, then you kind of roll the dice and say, we want you to develop during the course of the year. If you don't quite get there, maybe we fall a little short of the goal this season, but we're building a foundation, and you look at, which of those guys is possibly going to leave. Houston, to me, is maybe a 1 to 2 year guy. Diabate, I don't know. Diabate is tough for me because I think that athletically, physically, he has all the makeup of an NBA player, and they're not going to maybe care so much about what his actual production is on the floor freshman year. They're going to look at him. They're going to say he's an extremely raw prospect. He has some ball handling skills. He has the ability to maybe step and shoot a little bit. Like, I think there's enough flashes his freshman year where maybe he gets snapped up. Whereas Houston, you're going to see him shoot extremely well, but they're maybe going to want to see him put the ball on the deck a little bit more. And I'm not sure if we'll see that quite year one, maybe more into year two. To me, that's kind of the Christie path as well, where maybe they're more set shooters that year one. And then as they continue to get stronger and more comfortable with the ball at the college level, you see them expand their game a little bit and take that next step. So maybe Houston comes back another year. But the Frankie Collins, Kobe Buffkin, I think those are guys you're going to have for a couple of years. You have the ability to start a foundation early. And if Juwan's going to continue to recruit like he is, you want to be developing these guys so that all your talented guys can be on the floor at the same time. Imagine if you have top 50 guys who are now juniors and you mix in the top 10 guys, the top 15 guys with them. That is the almost combination that's eluded Tom Izzo for long stretches. I think we saw it a little bit kind of with Brandon Dawson, Adrian Payne, and then you added Gary Harris to the mix. And that team, then you're cooking with gasoline, right? And I think that to be able to ensure that those guys are ready sophomore year and into the beginning of junior year, you got to give them some rain freshman year. So I'm with you. I think Michigan State's in a very similar boat. My understanding, they've also been kind of searching for potentially another wing to add in the portal. And that guy almost, for me, needs to be like a Chauncey Brown, where he needs to be able to come in and give a bench role, because I want Max Christie starting. And I think that generally speaking, he needs to have a very set role. So it can't just be anyone that you enter into the program, because they have to be okay with the potential role that they're going to play. And that has to be, in some regards, taking into consideration the freshman minutes. So I'm 100% on board with you. We're almost hitting the hour and a half mark, so we're going to have to speed it up here. But why don't we touch on briefly just the winners and the losers thus far into Big Ten play? I'll start. For me, I think that Michigan State has won. The attrition that has happened has all, in my opinion, been positive thus far. Identifying a point guard that's an instant upgrade from what you had on the roster last year. You now have Walker, you now have Akins, you now have Hogard. There's much more options on the roster for that point guard spot. If one of those guys doesn't work out, if Hogard isn't able to develop, if Akins isn't 100% ready to run the show, then you run into a situation where there's three guys that can potentially play a couple different positions in the ball handling role. So I like that. The loser, I would say, it's got to be Iowa for me. Nunji ends up obviously tearing his knee. He goes down. He transfers, so they don't have a big. Garza is entering the NBA draft. Wieskamp, I think, sticks in the draft. I think he's a draftable guy, kind of in that top 40 range at least. I'm not quite sure what else he can prove in college. He kind of showed his entire game. And now you have CJ Frederick entering into the portal today, possibly heading to Kentucky, who is going to add maybe Kellen Grady and CJ Frederick, which is a ridiculous combination of shooting. So for me, really, I think, Iowa is going to be in a situation where it's Keegan Murray and then what? And they just extended him, which is absolutely hilarious. They give him a big old fat contract after he took the best team he's ever had to win a Big Ten. Oh, they didn't. To make it to the Sweet 16, which they haven't done in 20 plus years. Oh, he didn't. I don't know what to say. That whole program just basically hit the reset button, and they decided to pay Fran McCaffrey a fat contract in the middle of it. They are the biggest losers for me. And so where are you going with your two?
Hey, Fran McCaffrey is the man who published a DVD tutorial of himself that you can get on Amazon for $19.95, by the way, of how to play defense. That's not a joke. Fran McCaffrey's How to Play Defense is available. That's the biggest scam I've ever seen. I rode the Iowa bandwagon this year. I
rode it for some money too. And just brief pump for you too here at the end, if anyone's still listening. Greg does daily picks. What was your overall record this year?
Oh man, I don't know what it ended up.
It was positive. It doesn't matter.
I think I was 30 games up from 500. Yeah.
Yeah, unbelievable. It's extremely hard to do. I could pick stuff out of a hat and have as much of a chance of success of actually being able to watch it. And I watch quite a bit of college basketball. So he went positive this year. He was high on Iowa. I rode them a lot of times on Greg's advice and covered. But I think we both kind of knew what this team was going to be down the stretch and in the postseason. And they showed exactly who we thought they were going to be.
Yeah, Carter and I left them off our national title list, quote unquote, all season, even when they were like a top 5 team for parts, because we just couldn't trust Fran down the stretch. They're the obvious loser. I'm glad you said them. I mean, the Frederick stuff is crazy. Like we need a whole Kardashian style reality series on the transfer portal right now, because that's just absurd. If Wieskamp was thinking at all about coming back, he can't come back now. There's no point. It's going to be Keegan Murray and his brother, Chris Murray, who I still can't believe exists. I found that out like with a week left in the season. That
they were twins?
Yeah, I don't know. There's another Keegan Murray who's now going to be in the front court. That's exciting. But man, Iowa is going to be miserable. I have my other loser is Illinois, because I can't stop dunking on Illinois Graves right now. I still like that whole the trying to be the Luther Head, D Brown, Darren Williams 2.0 of this team was just not true. I loved this Illinois team this past year. It was really fun to watch them. But wow, I mean, to lose Adam Miller after what I thought was a really promising freshman year, to lose Kofi Coburn, who may or may not get drafted. Is that too harsh? I mean, I think he's probably getting drafted, but like I wouldn't.
Is he? What's his value in the NBA? He can't guard in space. I mean, he's a huge specimen.
That's the thing. I don't
think maybe a late flyer is taken. If not, he makes a G League team for a little bit and he ends up overseas, which is a great life. Don't get me wrong, but yeah, I'm not sure if he has an NBA destination, in his future.
No, I wouldn't be shocked at all if he never plays a real NBA minutes, which is hard. I mean, you lose. I think Illinois fans thought he was back. To lose Miller and him in the same offseason when you
and really Io, obviously.
And Io. I mean, that's a ton to replace. I know they're really pumped about Curbelo, but when Curbelo's surrounded by a bunch of question marks, I don't know that you're going to like what Curbelo ends up looking like there. He'll be fun to watch, but man. And then they bring Trent Frazier back, which I guess objectively is a good thing. But I think if you asked any Illinois fan, would they rather have Trent Frazier or sophomore Adam Miller? I don't know why you'd pick Trent Frazier, unless that's a title contending team next year, which I don't think is going to happen. So we'll see. Brad Underwood is going to have to regroup, hit the recruiting trail, or I believe he's got a couple guys. He got Payne from Florida in the transfer portal.
The front court is a mess. I mean, I recently posted about the wing and the kind of the 3-4 position, and I got a bunch of blowback from them about possible guys that were going to be X, Y, and Z. But if Kofi leaves, Georgie went to go play overseas in Europe. So they lost two. They're going to lose 2 centers. They're going to place him with Omar Payne, who was like a 4-and-4 guy. He couldn't get on the floor for Florida. He played 15 minutes a night. Like, yeah, he's athletic, but like, is that an upgrade in any fashion? No. Then they're, all I got from the chatter from the Illinois fans was that Coleman Hawkins is the next coming of Jesus Christ, basically. He played 6 minutes last year. He couldn't shoot. They're like, well, have you seen his high school tape? This isn't high school anymore. He showed a non-ability to look comfortable physically out on the Big Ten floor, which, a lot of freshmen do. It's the Big Ten. But I think that if you think there's just an instant plug and play guy, and, Rothstein thought that maybe Grandinson is going to be the starter on the wing at the small forward. If he's your small forward, your starting small forward, you have one of the worst small forwards starting in the league. He's just not that good. He's like a power forward to me, like probably a little bit better on the rim, an okay spot up shooter. He shot decent, but he took like 1.5 threes a game last year. I'm going to need to see it with a little bit more volume. And when there's a scouting report on him that he's a shooter, then they're telling me Adrian Hutchinson is going to be, the guy next year. He came from Wesleyan. It's possible. He was out all season with an injury. I guess he's back and he's looking healthy. Again, like there's a whole bunch of question marks. All their best players are 6'3" and under. DeMonte Williams, 6'3". Andre Curbelo, 6 foot. Trent Frazier, 6'2". Like that was their problem last year, is there was no size in the backcourt and on the wing. And it's going to be again this year. Like they got the Alfonso Plummer from Utah. I have no idea why Alfonso Plummer went there. I think that's very clear that Miller's not coming back, but he shot like almost 7 threes a game. He was close to 40%. You know who he would have been perfect for? He would have been perfect for like Indiana. Maybe go to a team like that needs some shooting and you could have played some significant minutes. To me, it's just like you're rewinding basically the Frazier button. If Frazier's playing 30 minutes per game and he's, your 6'2" shooting guard, what are you going to do? Is your best play to play a 3-guard lineup and everybody is 6'2" and under, like in the Big Ten?
Yeah.
I think they got a lot of question marks. Who do you got as your winner?
They've got pieces, but like those pieces don't make sense unless Miller and Coburn are back. Then they're a contender. But yeah, I think it's going to be a mess. My winner, I agree that Michigan State has objectively won the offseason versus losing it. I think the biggest winner in the conference for me so far has been Indiana. And I didn't love the Mike Woodson hire. I kind of joked about it when it happened. Like, really? We're getting a guy who's not even really like cool by NBA standards, and he's supposed to come in and recruit his butt off. But I don't know. I mean, we joke about Dane Fife, but he's also got Thad Matta on staff. Like, there seems to be a little buzz around that program right now. I was shocked that the first thing you heard with Indiana was that TJD is coming back. I mean, he should be the player of the year in the conference next year, in my opinion, unless Hunter Dickinson does what I think he could do. But
yeah,
TJD,
I want to interject just briefly there because I was in a locker room and one of the guys, I was an Indiana guy that runs, I can't remember the name of the website, but he was just basically speaking about the pitch that was made to TJD by Woodson. And my understanding is he sat him down for 2 hours. They ran tape and he showed him everything that he did wrong. He said, this is what you should have done in this situation. You should have shot with this. You should have gone to the left here. You should have gone to the right. And they basically did an NBA like film and like, I can make you better in these areas and make you a better NBA product if you stay one more year with me. So he sat him down. He made a serious pitch. Then he went back and did the same exact thing with his parents, and that sold him. I think that says a lot about it, that he was able to just like, this is what I can do for you, and this is the reason why you can stay. And they have a ton of momentum going for him, and I'll let you address that. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, to bring TJD back, then to also bring Christian Lander back, who, say what you want about him, he's a 5-star recruit that reclassified, and correct me if I'm wrong, reclassified point guards don't really work very well. I mean, that's the one position you don't want a guy who should be a senior in high school playing 40 minutes for you. I'm still high on Lander. I liked him out of high school. I would be surprised if he doesn't ever amount to a really good high-level Big Ten starting point guard. They just had a commitment today from Tamar Bates, I believe a 21 guard. There's just buzz in that program right now in a way that I never expected when Mike Woodson was hired. And I like their pieces they have. I mean, Rob Finney was a guy who impressed me as an underclassman. The wing, I forget why is his name trailing off from me right now, but he was a Michigan recruit on the wing. Jerome Hunter, I still think is a guy who's battled some injuries, but is a really like a 3-level scorer potentially if he's used in the right ways. And you could just tell by watching those Archie Miller teams, like they were a complete mess. They had talent. They just didn't run anything smooth. And they had a bunch of guys that didn't know where to be and didn't know what their role was. And if what you said with the film evaluation stuff is true with TJD, I mean, they're already way ahead of where they were last year. Was it Inside the Hall? Was that the website?
It wasn't Inside the Hall. It was a different group of guys. I have to go back and look because I should give him credit for it. But it was a locker room. I think Ant was running it, and it was another group of guys that run a site, and it was super, super interesting. They were just kind of giving an indication of how he was, pitching and bringing everybody back. I think obviously losing Durham. And Durham went to Providence, and who went to Virginia? Armand Franklin. So those were their 2 best 3-point shooters. Obviously, adding Tamar Bates is helpful. He's kind of a physical guard. I don't know what he shot from 3 and kind of what that projects. He seemed like more of a mid-range, a downhill guy to me, kind of physical, long. But they need to add a couple more shooters, in my opinion, around TJD. That's the one concern I have. Obviously, the Xavier Johnson from Pittsburgh, he's kind of that combo guard, physical. He shoots okay from 3. I think he was like around 34, 35% last year. So they have some pieces, like some high pieces to put around it. They got to put a couple more shooters somewhere on the floor because Race Thompson's not one. TJD isn't one. your point guard that you're probably going to run. Lander didn't shoot well last year. Maybe he shoots a little bit better, but you lost your two best shooters. If you find a way to just add like at least one knockdown guy to kind of create a little bit more space, I think that the roster is going to open up a little bit more for him. But I think all around, if you're an Indiana fan, you probably had a little bit of, sadness with the hire, but then they hire Thad Matta, and a guy that's been really, really successful at the college level, has recruited at an extremely high level, right? He grabbed Greg Oden, Mike Conley, Jaron Soldier. Like he's been a guy that's recruited at a very high level, knows how to run a college program. It seems like they put a really good staff around him to ensure that he's successful. And then his ability to, kind of transfer some of the offense to run some NBA sets. I'm with you. I think that Indiana is up there on the winner. And even if it doesn't matriculate into, a ton, I think that they need to make the tournament this year with TJD coming back. But really, outside of maybe winning a game in the tournament, I think that that's probably a successful season given the way that it's gone for them. I think that he's going to take this program and put it in the right direction, and he already has, in my opinion.
Yeah. Last thing, if they need a shooter, I know a guy went to Clarkston High School who could step right in and knock a couple threes down.
That's possible. You never know. You never know. Well, listen, we're at an hour and 40 minutes. If anybody is still listening, we really appreciate that. I'm David Klein, SpartanHoops.com. Greg Waddell, GWizzy12 on Twitter. Sleepers Media. You got to give it a listen. Drop a follow down. We're going to be coming with a lot more to go. This is obviously a very long and in-depth one. I'm going to start diving into a little bit of, the season in review, looking at some of the advanced stats for individual players and kind of discussing. And I think once I get a little bit bigger grasp on that, we will come back. We will talk about the roster and the way that it's shaping up. I'm sure that there's still going to be, some transfer portal news for either Michigan or Michigan State coming up. And so we will be back, maybe within a week or two to be able to discuss kind of the happenings again. Hopefully going to be able to do this at least every other week, probably once a week during the course of the season. Thanks again for dropping the follow, for hanging around. Again, from Spartan Hoops, I'm David Klein. He's Greg. Take care, boys.
Thanks, DK.